Hello everyone, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're returning to Cold Waters, the newest game out by Killerfish Games, the developers who brought us Atlantic Fleet and Pacific Fleet, and a hypothetical World War III submarine simulator which puts you in command of a US submarine. They are working on Soviet submarines as well, but it puts you in command of a U.S. nuclear submarine during a hypothetical Third World War. We are in the 7th part of this Let's Play series, which puts us in command of a Narwhal class submarine. Although I will say on that diagram there, it makes it look a little bit more like a like an LA to me, but I'm not a sub-expert. With that being said, we are on the 7th part of our Let's Play series, and the majority of this series has actually not been using the gameplay footage as the crux for these videos, and that trend will continue today. The videos that I'm doing here as a part of this Let's Play are actually looking at sort of historical topics during the Cold War. And so we decided, all right, we did a couple of classes of subs. We did the Foxtrot class. We did the, oh goodness. Well, the Foxtrot class was the only class of subs we did. We did a video on the Alpha, but that was just me fighting an Alpha. And then we did something on the United States Navy in 1945, and we just did a video on the Type 21 class U-boat, which was the German Navy's sort of Wunderwaffen, wonder weapon, which they developed toward the end of the Second World War, but never really saw combat. Actually, never did see combat. There were, I believe, 2 war patrols that were launched with it, but it never had a substantial opportunity to prove itself. And I just have to say, watching that torpedo is hilarious because you've got all those sunken ships in the background that you can see there. But with that being said, so we've kind of set things up for the beginning of the Cold War, right? We looked at the Narwhal class, we looked at the Foxtrot class, and then we went all the way back and said, all right, what was the Navy like? What was the U.S. Navy like at the end of World War II? And then, how did the German Type 21 class submarine revolutionize submarine warfare? And it really did in many ways. And that's, I know I got some hate from some people, some dislikes for some people on the last video because I was talking about, a submarine that's not in cold waters. I had the title of the submarine name, so I think some people may have felt it was misleading. If you feel that way, I'm sorry. I mean, the entire video was about the Type 21. But the reason it was important to have that last video was because the Type 21 shaped so much of the early Cold War submarine designs. And my intent with this series is to go from the beginning of the Cold War through to the 1984 campaign. We may not get that far in this particular Let's Play, but if we don't, we'll start another. And maybe at some point the Soviet submarines will come out as well, and we can share those as well. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump back in and where we left off, where we were talking about the Type 21 class German submarine. The next step in the Cold War for submarines, as far as submarines are concerned, is the United States Navy's attempt to modernize its submarine fleet. So we had already mentioned that the U.S. Navy had the largest, most modern submarine force at the end of World War II. Regardless of your opinion on the Type 21, there were only a handful of them that were actually serviceable. And so the U.S. Fleet Boat program was actually the most modern grouping of submarines in service. The Russians had a very strong submarine force themselves. We will get to that later. But at least at the end of World War II, the United States Navy has more than 150 modern submarines, which had just brought Japan to its knees in a war against Japanese commerce and warships. But now suddenly the Type 21 comes out. This brand new design comes out. The United States intercepts a few, telegrams or what have you between Germany and Japan. They start discovering, these boats as they're conquering Germany, and eventually they realize, holy crap, our submarine fleet is horribly obsolete when it comes to just comparing it to the Type 21. To everything else out there, our fleet is amongst the best, if not the best. But if the Type 21 gets its bugs and defects and other things worked out, then we are outclassed. And the Americans knew, the Russians captured several of these Type 21s, the British captured several of these Type 21s, and the Americans were already predicting a conflict of wills, if not an outright conflict, with the Soviet Union in Europe. And they knew that their submarine force would end up going up against Russian boats that were designed in the vein of the Type 21. So real quick, refreshing what that Type 21 boat revolutionized was these sort of streamlined hulls where you wouldn't have a whole bunch of protuberances, you wouldn't have a deck gun, you wouldn't have chucks, you wouldn't have large vents for your diving planes. You would have more modern sonar. They had more effective reloading for their torpedoes, rapid reloading when compared to previous torpedoes, torpedo tubes, that is. So just this all-around modern submarine. And the United States is sitting, almost like it's kind of holding the evidence right there in its hands of just, we've got all these boats, what do we do with them? So the Navy recognized that it needed to develop a new submarine along the lines of the Type 21, and it would eventually do that. I believe that was the Tang Class. But this video is going to look at a different program which was attempting to say, all right, the United States Navy has built a massive submarine force. We've got most of these boats are just a handful of years old. We've invested vast resources into this, and frankly, we're going into a peacetime economy, so we need to do something to try and reuse some of these boats, because frankly, if we don't, we're not going to have enough money to build 150 brand new submarines. So what are we going to do to use what we have but not get all our sailors killed if war ever breaks out because these things are obsolete? And that's what the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program was. So the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program was the Navy's attempt to modernize a large number of its fleet boat submarines to take advantage of many of the inventions and breakthroughs that the Type 21 class German submarine brought about. And that program had kind of a funny little nickname. Again, you can see GUPP, so Greater Underwater Propulsion Program, so GUP, but the Navy changed that last P to a Y for phonetic reasons, so it would be easier to pronounce. So it became the Guppy Program, as you will. As part of the Guppy program, the Navy identified 90 submarines which it could upgrade, 90 fleet boats which it could upgrade to the Guppy configuration. The conversions included basically all Type 21 features. A more rounded bow, for example, would allow the submarine to make better submerged performance. Not quite the teardrop hull innovation which would come later, but it certainly was something that was beginning to head in that direction. So basically, if you remember when we looked at World War II submarines, they had very much a kind of traditional triangle shape. I'm not sure what the name of that bow is, but if you think about any modern ship with that kind of triangular, narrow bow that kind of cuts through the water like a knife, well, the Guppy conversion started kind of rounding that off a bit, which would lead to greater submerged performance and greater submerged speeds. Additionally, the ships or the boats would have their conning tower and bridge encased in a streamlined fairweather, or what would become known as a sail. So when you think of nuclear submarines, that top part, that control center area, people refer to it as a sail. And this was the beginning of that. Again, the conning tower, the bridge, they used to kind of be open to the environment. It would be kind of a lot of drag could result in this. If you think about just kind of like a little deck on top of a boat with a whole bunch of metal railings and kind of nooks and crannies for water to get kind of jammed into. And again, this created drag, which slowed the submarine down. So rather than having all these, portholes, these openings, these areas that could help slow the submarine down, one of the big things that the Type 21 brought was this streamlined conning tower area. And so that's, a key component to the Guppy upgrades was a streamlined fairweather or sail. That would also house the periscopes. It would house the snorkel intake because these boats would end up being upgraded with snorkels as well. It would house, the deck guns and other projections, anything that came up off the hull, were removed. So the deck gun, you can think about World War II submarines tended to have around a 4-inch deck gun that would allow them to engage surface targets and preserve a torpedo. This was a legacy from back in World War I when individual sailing ships would sail alone and, the submarine could easily surface and engage this ship in favorable conditions, destroy it without the use of a precious and expensive torpedo. Well, the deck gun became more or less obsolete once the British really brought to bear the convoy system that they had. You weren't going to surface against a convoy. It ended up being relegated by the end of World War II to just kind of finishing off cripples that maybe were straggling behind. The U.S. used it a fair amount in the Pacific as well, because the Japanese still continued to have large numbers of sampans or other small ships that probably didn't warrant a torpedo, but a deck gun could be used against it, in addition to the lone sailing ships. But the deck guns were removed, so these ships all had deck guns, because you remember they are converted World War II submarines, but that deck gun was removed. Even in some of the versions of the Guppy project, even as much as a full diesel engine was removed to provide more space for a new sonar room. Air conditioning, I think that was actually a common trait on most U.S. fleet boats, at least early in the war. But for what that's worth. Additionally, this was the first attempt for the U.S. to start outfitting its submarines with a system called the Prairie masker system, which what that basically is it is a system that puts bubbles into the water around the submarine. It kind of pumps just air bubbles into the water around the submarine. And what that does is it masks the effectiveness of sonar. So it's kind of like that first, I don't know if I'd call it a noisemaker, but it's that first, active countermeasures to enemy sonar and enemy incoming torpedoes, which might confuse them with that additional water barrier between the submarine and the torpedo, made it more difficult. It kind of masked the location of the submarine. U.S. surface warships would end up using Prairie masker systems as well to defend themselves, and it was something that was common on Prairie-class frigates. It might actually still be used today, I'm not sure, but it was definitely common through warships all the way through the 1980s, whereas, this is, I believe these are some of the first versions of warships that would have included this. In addition to all of that work, the electric batteries were increased. The capacity of the batteries were increased substantially to allow for greater submerged durations. If you remember, submarines tended to only have about an hour worth of submerged battery time at flank speeds back in World War II timeframes, and additional batteries were added to increase the capacity. These were all, minus the Prairie masker system, these were all innovations that the Type 21 had brought to the fore. As you can see here, we're looking at a Juliet guided missile submarine, so a submarine that shoots out anti-ship missiles, almost like an SSBN, but instead of carrying nukes, it's carrying guided conventional weapons for use against convoys, and that's what I'm trying to sink in this video. But going back to the history, another common upgrade for the Guppies was actually the sonar. So before I get into the sonar real quick, I just want to talk about what the Guppy upgrade program really was, in the sense that, you say Guppy upgrade, and intuitively you probably think, oh, there's one specific set of upgrade with a specific set of suites. That's not really the case. The Guppy One Program was the first group of submarines, only consisted of two. But then there was the Guppy 2, the Guppy 1A, the Guppy 2A, the Guppy 1, and the Guppy 1B, and the Guppy 3. So basically you had the Guppy 1s, and then they were upgraded numerous times to 1A and 1B. Then you had the Guppy 2 and the Guppy 3 programs. But there were a whole bunch of upgrades that were part of this, and at the end of the day, there was more than 58 fleet submarines that were upgraded via the Guppy program. Additionally, there was a fleet Snorkel program when the Navy realized, oh shoot, we're running out of money. We're not going to be able to fund upgrades to every one of these submarines. So rather than, upgrade everything, the Navy also focused on upgrading their submarines to include snorkels, because, hey, at least if we get a snorkel on the sub, it can be more efficient and allow it to stay submerged longer than other scenarios. So just calling that out, that I'm not going to go into all the details, but there were three major groups of upgrades with a bunch of subset upgrades included in there, and then often the fleet boat upgrades get lumped in with Guppies, although it's kind of technically a different thing. The Guppies, again, there were 58 of them. They were in service into the 1970s with the United States, and actually several of them were exported or sold to other countries when they were dismembered with the U.S. One of them in Brazil stayed in service, I believe, all the way till the early 2000s. So some of these boats were around quite a while after their 1940 constructions. And even in the U.S. Navy, they kind of bridged a vital gap. The Guppies were also upgraded with their sonar, as I mentioned before. So one of the things that the German submarines, actually, I believe this was all the German submarines. It wasn't just limited to the Type 21. Had a very modern sonar system. It was called the Ghg, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it, but basically the Ghg sonar was the most modern sonar. Modern, I can't speak. The Ghg was the most modern sonar system in the world. When the U.S. got their hands on these German submarines, for the first couple of Guppies, they just ripped out the existing Ghg sonars from some of the subs that they had captured and put them in the U.S. boats. For later ones, they developed a sonar system called the BQR-2, which was basically just an American carbon copy of the Ghg, and that served much later into the Cold War. In fact, if memory serves me right, the Skipjack class has the BQR, which is the passive sonar system that the Germans used in their boats. And what kind of made it special was the integration that the sonar had with the targeting computer in the submarine, so that it would capture all this information and start autonomously passing it through to different systems in the submarine, which was not always the case for many sonars. So with that being said, the sonar was upgraded. The diesel engines were kind of modified or reduced. The electric batteries were upgraded. The hull was modified to allow it to move quicker. Sort of extravagancies like the deck guns were removed. The conning tower and bridge were encased in what was called a sail, so that they would be more acoustically pleasing, I guess is what you would say. And all of these upgrades were made so that the U.S. fleet of submarines could continue to operate more effectively. The Guppies weren't without their own problems, however. And by the way, before I get into the problems with the Guppy, this was apparently some kind of bug where it was telling me that the mission goal wasn't successful, even though the mission actually was successful. I sunk the exact submarines I was supposed to sink, and the game, for whatever reason, threw me this message. But then, after that, it comes back and throws you a mission successful message right afterwards from, like, the newspaper articles. And the way the campaign progresses, and if you check your actual your campaign achievements, like your tonnage and your missions complete, this still counted as a mission complete. So just kind of bizarre. Not sure why it treated it that way. But anyway, back to the Guppy program and some of the issues that the program did run into. First of all, what happened to the submarines that had these upgrades? We talked about them being able to move quicker and trying to make the submarine more efficient, faster reloading torpedoes, all these kind of things. And at the end of the day, the Guppies, they were able to operate effectively, and yet they did have some problems. So first off, what happened to the submarines? Well, their upgrades did allow the submarines to reach anywhere between 14 and 16 knots submerged. Non-converted U.S. fleet boats, even with upgrades like improved batteries, generally couldn't make above 10 knots. So pretty substantial difference there. A third better, or actually up to 15% better, or up to 50% better than some of the other submarines, and nearly double the wartime performances of the U.S. fleet boats during World War II. Additionally, there were some issues. For example, the Guppies were rather noisy. All of these conversions and modifications, you got to remember, these boats were designed one way. They were designed to operate a specific way, and obviously they were not operating in that fashion, and so they had some drawbacks. One of them was that they were pretty noisy. U.S. fleet boats in World War II were quiet. They were quieter than their German equivalents, but the Type 21 was very quiet, and so that was sort of the exception. The Type 21 was found to be, at 12 knots submerged, quieter than the best U.S. fleet submarines at 6 knots. So, the Guppies were a bit noisier. There were some efforts during the upgrades to install some noise reduction gear. It certainly was... It was met with greater, varying degrees of success. Some of the Guppies had some of their torpedo reloads removed to allow more space for berthing, because these ships were intended to be on long duration patrols. One of the big issues was the snorkel operations. There was just the snorkels were unreliable, and it was very unpleasant to be on. They also had some severe issues of of rattling. So one fleet member kind of remarked that he nearly lost his teeth because the vibrations in the submarine while it was operating submerged were so bad. And again, if you think about it, a submarine probably shouldn't have massive vibrations, because where there's vibrations going on, there are noises that are being created. So it's certainly not something you want a ton of vibration going on in your submarine below the surface, because again, that's one, it might rattle something loose and kind of damage something, but two, it's also creating noise and obviously making life very unpleasant. So the snorkels were not up to snuff. They weren't very well regarded, and again, they made life miserable. There'd be this sort of popping noise or this sensation of like the suction sensation that submariners had to go through as the snorkels were being operated. So certainly wasn't pleasant in that regard. And again, the vibrations also not very, very good. And the boats were still noisy. But I do think it's important to regard the Guppy program as a success. The reason I would consider these boats a success is because, again, the fleet upgraded 58 of these things. So a third of the submarine fleet was upgraded. The submarine fleet was actually, reduced in size. The Navy budgets was reduced in size. And so the Navy started work on a follow-on class called the Tang Class, which was sort of the U.S.'s attempt to build the Type 21 in a fully fledged manner, build a U.S.-designed and built submarine that would replicate the Type 21's features as well as any new additions that had come out since then, and, be the most modern U.S. submarine. With that being said, the Navy only had a limited budget, so by modifying these submarines, the U.S. Navy ensured it had up to 50 submarines it could call on for the next 20 to 30 years after World War II. And these submarines, even if they weren't the best submarines out there, they served a purpose. They operated effectively, and they conducted various missions during the Cold War. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, those missions largely remain classified today, so it's not really possible to understand everything that they did, but they had a high operational tempo. These diesel boats were used 20 to 30 years into the Cold War, and the Navy was able to do things that it wouldn't have been able to do because it had a large number of diesel boats left over from World War II. A interesting document that I found online about the Guppy program says it more or less succinctly, or at least how I view it, is the success of submarine Cold War operations is directly related to the crews and the Guppy conversions. These submarines and their crews certainly held the line during the Cold War until the SSNs and SSBNs took over to continue the high tradition of the United States submarine service. So again, that's kind of, I think, putting it a very good way in that these submarines weren't the most modern, they weren't the most effective, they probably were inferior to a lot of the other boats that were out there, including the Russian boats that were coming down the ways and being used during the Cold War. But the fact that the Navy had these boats that it could call on allowed the Navy to do things during the early period of the Cold War that it wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. These boats, in quite a literal sense, held the line for the Navy to be able to allow it to do things that it needed to do, even with the recognition that they were not necessarily the best tool for the job. So I think that's the best way you can really position it. And at the end of the day, I think the Guppy program was a successful program, a program where you find out, all right, well, these ships we all have are obsolete, but let's not just go throw everything out. Let's not abandon what got us here. Let's consider what we have, and let's figure out how to make it work. And in traditional sort of Navy, in a traditional sort of sailor's way of jerry-rigging things to work, the Navy was able to get the Guppies to work to a standard that allowed it to accomplish the goals that it needed to accomplish until the nuclear-armed or nuclear-fast attack submarines really became more commonplace, and until the nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines also became more commonplace. Oh, one other thing I thought I would mention before I kind of go into the conclusion here that I just found was that it became apparent during the mid-1950s as technology was advancing and these submarines becoming more and more needing of modern fire controls, electronic countermeasure equipment, ESM equipment, sonar equipment, that all of these pieces of data took up large numbers of space. So some of the boats that were already under construction or being upgraded to the Guppy configuration when all of this was being done, and they were still in decent shape, were actually brought into the shipyards while this was all going on. I think this was part of the Guppy 2 program. The boats were cut in half, and they added a new 15-foot section to the boat, which is just mind-boggling to me that you'd think about this boat that was designed to go deep underwater with vast pressures on all points of the submarine, all angles and all rivets and everything like that. It's designed to go underwater, and the structural integrity of this boat is basically its lifeblood. And you take that boat, you chop it in half, you add a 15-foot segment to it, and then you weld it all back together again or tie it all back together again. I'm just like, I don't know if that reduced the efficiency or the quality of the boats, but somehow the Navy made it work. And, they added 15 feet with these new pieces to it. It was the extension was in the forward end of the control room, created new space for sonar, and the conning tower was also renewed with an additional 5 feet. So basically the conning tower was expanded to accommodate what was called the Mark 101 fire control system and the Mark 37 torpedo director, while the fire control system was also expanded at the same time. So just kind of interesting, the ingenuity that can go into keeping a vessel or a ship in service, as long as you can. And getting the most out of your investment. And I really feel like World War II vehicles in general had that done. I wouldn't say the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines or, or the Army, they don't do that in general, but it was really impressive to see Essex-class carriers built during World War II before the era of jets would be continued to be used well into the 70s. Actually, I think a couple of them lasted till the end of the Cold War, or at least very late Cold War in the 80s. Where some of these World War II, carriers are still around, despite the fact that they are not built in a way that was ideal for the way jet combat would occur. For example, jet aircraft would typically have a angled flight deck, and these things didn't. So it was a completely different experience. Obviously smaller air wings. They didn't initially have steam catapults, I don't believe. So all of these interesting little tidbits or notions that the Navy did and armed forces do time after time to keep things in service far longer than originally intended, even when the strategic situation changes. But that's not really the point of this video. So I know I got a little bit rambly. Again, this video was about the Guppy class conversions for the U.S. fleet boats, and it was, hopefully you learned something here. Again, there were just so many different versions of the submarine that it was impossible to say specifically every single Guppy class and what every single one did and how every single one performed. But in general, there were a few drawbacks, but at the end of the day, the boat operated effectively throughout the majority of its time. It stayed in service until the 70s, as I've already said multiple times, and bought time for the nuclear submarines to start coming off the ways. With that being said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and end this video here. I hope you enjoyed the video. The next video that we're going to look at in this series, we'll be looking at the Tang Class submarines. So we mentioned the Guppies, which are the U.S. Navy's attempt to stopgap its way into Type 21 improvements. The Tang Class submarine was the United States Navy first post-World War II design, the first Cold War submarine design that was largely based off the Type 21 German submarine and was the Navy's attempt to mimic the improved performances of the Type 21 so that it would have a fully modern submarine, not something that was jerry-rigged into being good enough. So that's where the next video will pick up. We'll be looking at the Tang Class. I hope you guys enjoyed the video as always, and until next time, thank you for listening, thanks for tuning in. This is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out. Oh, by the way, real quick, there's like 2 minutes left in this video, at least in terms of the combat, so the description and the history and all that's over, but I didn't want to drag it out any more than necessary. But I am going to launch another torpedo against this enemy submarine that surfaced, and I know someone in the previous video said, hey, it would have been great for the battle to end. I don't have any more content to talk about before that, but I'm just going to throw some music in here, and hope you guys enjoy the rest of the fight, and then again I'll see you guys next time for the Tang engagement, or the Tang history. Alright guys, thanks again.